rock and roll singer Rick Nelson was killed last night in a private plane crash in Texas. Officials say that his charter DC-3 caught fire in flight and crashed while trying to make an emergency landing.
The Ricky Nelson mystery has finally been solved. The rock and roll legend was murdered disguised as a mechanical failure. For over 30 years, the real story about how 7 passengers died.
Rick Nelson and 5 band members on their way to a Dallas hotel for a New Year's Eve concert, all killed. The charter Douglas DC-3 reportedly caught fire in midair. The pilot tried first to land the plane on a road.
Only steps from an exit, while the pilots escaped through cockpit windows, and how hidden maintenance records exposed a plane known to be unsafe was long buried. So why did no one face justice? And who spread the cocaine rumors just to keep their secret safe? Join us as we solve Rick Nelson's mystery. 7 dead bodies at the exit door. December 31st, 1985. A Douglas DC-3 drops out of the sky and comes apart in a cow pasture in Texas, just a couple of miles short of the runway. When firefighters reach the wreck, they find something they never forget. 7 people crammed near the front of the cabin, arms stretched toward the exit. A few still have their hands wrapped around the door handle. Others are slumped over each other. All of them died trying to get out. First responder Lewis Glover wrote down what he saw, and it stayed in the official record ever since. All the bodies are there at the front of the plane. Apparently, they were trying to escape the fire. They were only inches from the outside air, so close that they probably thought they had a real chance. But they didn't make it. The pilots, 34-year-old Brad Rank and 40-year-old Kenneth Ferguson, managed to squeeze out through the cockpit windows, burned and blistered, but alive. Everyone behind the closed cockpit door never had that opportunity. They were overcome by smoke long before the airplane hit the ground. Among the victims were 45-year-old rock icon Rick Nelson, who had racked up 53 Billboard Hot 100 songs. His fiancée, 28-year-old Helen Blair, crew member Donald Clark Russell, 35, pianist Andy Chapin, 33, guitarist Bobby Neal, 38, bassist Patrick Woodward, and drummer Rick Intveld, just 22. Later forensic work confirmed the awful truth. All 7 passengers died from smoke inhalation while the plane was still flying. They didn't die on impact. They died breathing in toxic fumes, crawling toward a door that couldn't save them. The closed cockpit door gave the pilots just enough separation to break their windows and escape. The others had nothing: no fire suppression, no protective materials, no alarm, no usable exit, and really, no shot at survival. For 40 years, the official explanation remained maddeningly vague. Probable heater malfunction. Exact cause, undetermined. That was the closest thing to a conclusion offered by authorities, a statement that left far more questions than it answered. The National Transportation Safety Board spent a full year investigating the crash, reviewing the aircraft, interviewing the surviving pilots, and analyzing what little evidence remained. Yet, they still could not identify what actually ignited the fire. Without a clear cause, the disaster was treated as an unfortunate anomaly rather than a preventable catastrophe. The investigation stalled, and public attention shifted elsewhere. Families of the 7 victims were left to grapple with grief compounded by uncertainty. They had no definitive explanation for why their loved ones had died, no accountability to hold anyone responsible. The official files, filled with reports, witness statements, and technical analyses, accumulated dust, effectively abandoned by the agencies meant to enforce aviation safety. For decades, the truth remained locked away, buried beneath bureaucratic language and half measures, leaving the tragedy unresolved in every meaningful way. But eventually, a handful of aviation historians who study old aircraft accidents wouldn't let it go. They tracked down paperwork that had been tucked away, misfiled, or somehow lost. And what they uncovered didn't look like a freak accident. It looked like something that could have been stopped, a disaster waiting to happen. And after decades of silence, the truth finally came out. 7 people died in a fire that plenty of people already knew was a risk. Why, if so many people knew trouble was coming, did one pilot beg the other to keep the truth buried? And what exactly were they so afraid the world would find out? Don't tell anyone about the heater. When the co-pilot Kenneth Ferguson pulled himself out of the burning wreck, his hands blistered and his clothes still giving off smoke, he expected the man beside him, Pilot Brad Rank, to ask about the others on board. Maybe to check whether anyone else had made it out, or whether help had been called. But according to Ferguson, Rank grabbed him and said something entirely different. Something that would echo louder decades later than it did in that field. Don't say anything about the heater. Don't mention the heater. No concern for the passengers. No questions about the condition of the crew. Just a panicked order to stay quiet about one specific thing. That kind of reaction isn't confusion or shock. It's a man desperately trying to hide what he already knows. It's the reaction of someone who understands the weight of what has just happened and is terrified of being held responsible for it. Ferguson didn't keep the secret. When investigators from the NTSB interviewed both pilots separately, their accounts didn't line up, and the cracks in their stories revealed far more than either man intended. In his interview, Ferguson explained that Rank kept leaving the cockpit throughout the flight to check on the cabin heater, which had been acting up long before the fire ever began. Rank, he said, repeatedly pressured him to switch the heater back on, despite the strange behavior and the uneasy feeling the co-pilot had about using it at altitude. At one point, Ferguson flat out refused. He told the board he didn't believe they should be messing with that heater en route, because something was clearly wrong. He sensed they were one bad decision away from disaster. Rank's account was almost the opposite. He claimed he only left the cockpit once, after noticing smoke mid-cabin, where Rick Nelson and Helen Blair were seated. According to him, he checked the heater in the rear of the plane, found it cool, saw nothing alarming, activated the automatic extinguisher, and returned as though it were just another checklist item. Nothing unusual, nothing that would have concerned a by-the-book pilot. But if Rank truly believed it was an ordinary malfunction, an unavoidable unlucky moment, why was he begging Ferguson not to mention the heater before investigators even arrived? Why would someone who did everything by procedure be so desperate to hide the very piece of equipment he claimed wasn't causing trouble? Investigators didn't buy Rank's version. The NTSB report made that clear. They determined Rank had failed to follow the in-flight fire checklist, opened vents that fed oxygen to the flames, didn't tell the passengers to use supplemental oxygen, and never used the handheld extinguisher that was easily accessible in the cockpit. In their dry, bureaucratic language, these failures reduced the potential for passenger survival. In plain language, people died because the pilot made the situation worse. What makes the situation even more infuriating is how much time the pilots actually had. They communicated with air traffic control. They looked for landing options. They had a cockpit door that delayed the smoke and windows that could be opened for air. They had every advantage the people behind them did not. And as Ferguson told investigators, the heater had already been acting up before they even left the ground. It wasn't a surprise. It was a known problem, yet they flew anyway. 7 people died trying to reach an exit they never got the chance to open. But the pilots, flawed as they were, weren't the true architects of this tragedy. They were simply the final weak link in a system that had been failing long before takeoff. The real question, the one investigators should have asked from the start, is this: who allowed that plane to fly at all? Before anyone could even begin digging into that question, an uglier story swept through the news, one that shifted attention away from the people truly responsible and aimed it straight at the victim. Someone pushed a lie that nearly wiped out everything Rick Nelson had built. The real mystery is this: who started it and why? Spread the cocaine story. Criminals walk free. 72 hours after Rick Nelson was laid to rest, while his children were still trying to make sense of the fact that their father was suddenly gone, a different kind of tragedy began unfolding. Before the flowers at his funeral had even wilted, tabloids began pushing a story that would stain his name for decades: that cocaine freebasing inside the aircraft had sparked the fire. Reporters claimed unnamed sources had told them. Newsrooms said they were receiving anonymous tips. Suddenly, rumors about drug paraphernalia supposedly found in the wreckage were everywhere. No one questioned the timing, the vagueness, or the total lack of evidence. They simply ran with it. Within a day, the narrative had mutated into something grotesque. A troubled rock star gets high on a plane, starts a fire, and takes 6 innocent people with him. Television hosts repeated the claims as if they were proven fact. Radio personalities turned it into punchlines. Headlines across the country framed Nelson not as a victim, but as the cause of his own death. For his family, it felt like losing him twice. His children, Tracy, twins Gunnar and Matthew, and his youngest, Sam, watched their father's life be collapsed into a cliché he didn't belong to. His ex-wife, Kristen, already dealing with the emotional and legal aftermath of his passing, suddenly had to defend the character of a man who could no longer speak for himself. Overnight, Rick Nelson became a symbol of rock and roll excess instead of what he actually was: a respected musician who died in a preventable accident. And the public didn't hesitate to believe it. The story fit too neatly into the stereotypes people already held: a faded teen idol, a dangerous habit, a dramatic downfall. Why would anyone question a story that is sensational? It had everything: fame, drugs, scandal, tragedy. Most people never bothered to ask whether any of it was true. It wasn't. Not a single piece. When the NTSB released its toxicology results, the truth was plain. Nelson's system was completely clean. No cocaine, no alcohol, nothing. Investigators found no drug paraphernalia in the wreckage. Not in the cabin, not in the flight bags, not anywhere. No residue, no pipes, no evidence at all. After an exhaustive year-long investigation, federal officials publicly stated that drugs had absolutely no connection to the fire or the crash. But by the time the truth came out, the damage had been done. Newspapers that plastered accusations on page 1 buried the corrections deep inside. Entertainment shows that had eagerly spread the rumor barely mentioned the retraction. Even today, nearly 40 years later, people still repeat those false claims, unaware or uninterested that they were debunked before the 1980s were over. This wasn't an innocent mistake or careless reporting. It was targeted character sabotage, and it served a purpose. The cocaine story conveniently shifted public attention away from the entities who actually faced potential liability: the operators of a poorly maintained aircraft with a known mechanical hazard. If the world believed a drug-using rock star caused the fire, then there was no need to look at maintenance records, ignored warnings, or years of negligence. The rumor did exactly what it was meant to do. It clouded the public's perception, cast doubt on the victim, and redirected scrutiny away from the people who had allowed a dangerously faulty plane to fly. While Nelson's family fought to clear his name, those responsible for the aircraft faced barely any pressure at all. In the end, 7 people died. The victim was smeared, and the individuals who created the lie simply walked away, their motives never questioned, their identities never exposed. It would take 4 decades before the real story finally surfaced, and it was never about drugs. It was about a truth that had been buried deliberately. Buried where? In the maintenance files, documents that held details so alarming It's a wonder anyone ever walked away from that plane alive. But what, exactly, was inside those records that people were so determined to keep out of sight? Maintenance records showed it was a flying time bomb. The turning point came when a small group of aviation historians decided to revisit details that should have been examined properly back in 1986. They began requesting records from storage sites, combing through dusty FAA files, and digging through boxes that had been shuffled between regional offices for decades. What they uncovered wasn't a mystery. It was a slow-motion disaster spelled out in dry technical notes, ignored warnings, and maintenance logs that practically screamed trouble. The DC-3's heating system had been malfunctioning for months. Not intermittently, not once in a blue moon, constantly. The logs described strange burning odors during flights, complaints of hot spots on the cabin floor, reports of smoke creeping through vents, electrical irregularities in the heater's power feed. These issues appeared over and over, noted by pilots, mechanics, and even passengers. Anyone reading the logs chronologically would have seen a pattern that could only end one way. Once investigators tracked down musicians and crew who had flown on the plane in the weeks leading up to the crash, their accounts made the paperwork even more alarming. Several recalled mentioning a burning smell mid-flight and being told not to worry. Others remembered feeling odd bursts of heat rising through the flooring. On some flights, the stench became strong enough that passengers complained repeatedly. Each time, they got the same reassuring brush-off. It's just an old heater acting up. These old birds do that. Except these old birds don't spontaneously produce smoke unless something is very, very wrong. Mechanics who understood the DC-3 heating system explained why these symptoms were so dangerous. The heater sits beneath the cabin floor, tucked among fuel lines, electrical bundles, and layers of insulation. It's an area where a faulty part or a lazy repair can create a perfect storm. Maintenance on these heaters isn't optional. It's the only thing preventing exactly the kind of fire that would eventually claim 7 lives. The system requires approved components, proper installation, and regular inspections. You can't improvise repairs without turning the aircraft into a flying hazard. But that, investigators discovered, is exactly what had been happening. They found signs of unauthorized modifications, repairs made with incorrect materials, and shortcuts that violated FAA regulations. Parts that should have been replaced weren't. Procedures that should have been followed weren't. The heater system had essentially been cobbled together piece by piece, just functional enough to pass casual inspection, but far from airworthy. After the crash, the heater access panel was discovered unlatched, strongly suggesting that someone had recently worked on it and failed to secure it. Witness accounts and pilot testimony confirmed that the crew had repeatedly attempted to activate the heater shortly before the fire began. It wasn't responding properly, and they kept trying anyway, feeding power to a system that had been making trouble for months. And when it finally failed, everything around it was ready to burn. The insulation beneath the cabin was old and dried out. There were no fire extinguishers accessible to passengers, no modern fire retardant materials, no functioning suppression system, no way for the people in that cabin to do anything except gasp for air that wasn't there. The result was inevitable. The heater ignited, the flames found fuel immediately, and the cabin filled with toxic smoke in minutes. What turns this from a tragedy into something far darker is that none of this was unknown. Every failure, every shortcut, every mechanical red flag had been written down somewhere. It was all documented, then ignored. And that led investigators to a much larger question. Who made those decisions? Because mechanics didn't choose these shortcuts alone. Someone higher up set the tone, approved the practices, and decided that the plane would fly no matter what the paperwork said. What the historians eventually uncovered wasn't an accident at all. It was the aftermath of a company culture built on cutting corners, and the result was 7 preventable deaths. But why would experienced aviation mechanic who knew exactly how deadly these mistakes could be approve repairs they understood weren't safe? What kind of pressure were they facing, and who was issuing the directives that pushed skilled professionals into becoming unwilling accomplices? Mechanics break their silence. The turning point didn't come from a new lab test or a rediscovered document. It came years later, when persistent reporters finally reached the mechanics and crew members who had worked on that old DC-3 during the months before it became the site of 7 preventable deaths. What they described erased any lingering belief that the tragedy was simply bad luck. These weren't anonymous tipsters looking for revenge. They were seasoned aviation workers who had carried the weight of what happened for most of their adult lives, waiting for the day someone bothered to listen. Their accounts revealed a workplace built on quiet coercion and routine negligence, all dressed up to look like ordinary business operations. Several mechanics explained that they were routinely pushed, not casually encouraged, but pushed to sign off on maintenance that wasn't truly complete. The message from management was unmistakable. The plane needed to stay in the air because downtime meant lost revenue. They remembered the exact phrases: "Just skip the full inspection, the client's already waiting," or "That leak's not enough to ground her, just log it." And hanging over everything was the bluntest threat of all: "Sign off, or we'll find someone who will." The problems simply accumulated. Reports went into folders. Those folders went onto shelves, and nobody with real authority ever bothered to act on them. Each delay, each shortcut, each pressured signature allowed issues to grow worse. But as long as the aircraft kept flying, the cash kept coming in, and that seemed to be all that mattered. One former mechanic carried a story that still shook him decades later. He had followed FAA protocol meticulously when documenting the malfunctioning heater. He logged the issue, escalated it, and marked it as a genuine safety threat. He remembered watching supervisors acknowledge the paperwork and then effectively do nothing. "I knew it was going to end badly," he said, wiping his face during the interview. "I just didn't know when. I warned them, over and over. They ignored every one of my reports." He had done everything by the book. The people above him simply chose not to act. They weighed the cost of a proper repair against the revenue the airplane brought in and decided that the risk was worth it. That calculation cost 7 people their lives. This wasn't one bad call made by one exhausted worker on one busy afternoon. It was a corporate mindset, a culture of cutting corners and betting that catastrophe wouldn't strike. Mechanic after mechanic described the same environment: impossible schedules, pressure to improvise unsafe fixes, and a clear expectation that good enough was close enough. Safety rules were treated like bothersome suggestions. FAA guidelines were obstacles to work around. Manufacturer recommendations were ignored whenever they slowed the operation down. Experts who later reviewed the evidence didn't hedge their conclusions. Veteran inspectors and master mechanics agreed the disaster was entirely avoidable. Proper heater repairs would have stopped it. Following the maintenance schedule would have stopped it. Grounding the plane after multiple warnings would have stopped it. Any one of those decisions could have saved 7 people. The mechanics who signed off on the shortcuts played a role, but they weren't the architects of the system. Someone higher up set the tone. Someone decided revenue mattered more than repair. Someone repeatedly said, "Fly it anyway." And investigators kept circling back to the same question: who was that person? And how did they walk away without a single consequence? The investigation eventually pointed to a single individual, the buyer, who put his faith in the wrong operators and ended up paying for it with his life. The man who owned the death trap. What happened next in the investigation is the part that still infuriates anyone who learns the details. The DC-3 that ultimately turned into a funeral pyre in the sky wasn't some random rental or unknown aircraft. It was one Rick Nelson had personally purchased in May of 1985 for $118,000. The plane was a 1944 model, already 4 decades old when he bought it. It had an impressive pedigree on paper, having once been owned by the DuPont family and later by Jerry Lee Lewis. For Nelson, who hated commercial flights but refused to spend endless hours on a tour bus, it seemed like the perfect compromise: private travel, reliable enough, and steeped in history. But from almost the moment he signed the papers, the plane started sending out warning signs that no one should have ignored. The mechanical failures weren't subtle. During one incident, the band had to physically push the aircraft off a runway after an engine quit while taxiing. Months later, in September 1985, the ignition magneto malfunctioned and prevented the plane from starting at all. That failure alone cost Nelson his scheduled appearance at the very first Farm Aid concert. A huge professional embarrassment and a glaring clue that something was deeply wrong with the aircraft's upkeep. It's important to understand that Rick Nelson wasn't repairing this plane himself. He wasn't cutting corners. He wasn't making judgment calls about airworthiness. He hired licensed operators and mechanics whose entire job was to make sure the aircraft met safety standards. He paid them, trusted them, and relied on the certificates they signed. When they told him the aircraft was safe, he believed them because he assumed, reasonably, that qualified aviation professionals were doing their jobs. Those operators, whose identities became shielded by settlements and tangled legal records, were responsible for everything that kept the plane in the air: inspections, maintenance, and the all-important airworthiness sign-offs. They were the ones reading the maintenance logs. They were the ones seeing the repeated warnings about the heating system. They were the ones deciding which repairs mattered and which could be postponed. And they were the ones who kept certifying the plane as safe, despite knowing it wasn't. When the NTSB finally revealed the truth after the crash, the findings were devastating. The heater that ultimately triggered the fire had been poorly maintained. Repairs had been patched together with incorrect parts. Mandatory inspections were either incomplete or improperly documented. Warning signs about malfunctioning equipment had been brushed aside. Even the unlatched access panel suggested someone had recently tinkered with the heater without doing the job correctly. And evidence showed the crew had tried repeatedly to activate that same faulty heater during the final flight, despite its long history of problems. Yet despite all of this, despite the documented negligence, the ignored warnings, the obvious patterns of corner cutting, the operators never faced criminal charges, not a single one. They dealt with FAA scrutiny, endured NTSB questioning, and ultimately settled civil lawsuits. But none of them were charged with negligent homicide or manslaughter. None of them served a day behind bars. The reason was loopholes. In the mid-1980s, aviation law simply wasn't built to prosecute corporate negligence as a crime. Companies could be fined. Licenses could be revoked. Families could sue. But prison sentences for decisions that killed people? The legal structure didn't support it. So the people responsible wrote checks, adjusted their paperwork, and continued their lives. The families of the 7 victims received settlements that did nothing to mend the devastation. And the man who had trusted professionals to keep him safe paid the highest price for other people's shortcuts. Regulations were tightened after the tragedy, but for the victims, those improvements came far too late. The changes were written only after 7 people lost their lives to preventable negligence. But what really unfolded during those final 60 seconds when 7 people suddenly understood they couldn't get out? And how does knowing what they went through turn this from a simple tragedy into undeniable evidence that something far worse was at play? The final 60 seconds was murder. Forensic evidence has reconstructed those final moments inside the DC-3 with chilling precision, creating a portrait of fear and helplessness that is almost unbearable to imagine. Understanding exactly what happened in that cabin during the last minute transforms the story from a tragic accident into something far darker. Deaths that were entirely preventable, and yet were allowed to happen. The fire didn't erupt all at once. It crept in quietly, which is what makes it so horrifying, because there was time, maybe 30 to 60 seconds, when intervention could have saved every life on board. Around 5:14 p.m. Central Standard Time, somewhere over DeKalb, Texas, passengers first noticed a strange smell. Faint at first, but unmistakably wrong, like insulation or wiring burning somewhere they couldn't see. Rick Nelson was sitting in the middle of the cabin, his fiancée Helen Blair beside him. The band members were scattered around the seating area. Someone probably asked, "Do you smell that?" A few heads turned. People sniffed the air, looked under seats, tried to locate the source. There was curiosity, concern, but no panic. After all, planes sometimes have weird smells, right? Then the smoke began rising through the floorboards. At first, thin tendrils, easy to dismiss, but within seconds, it thickened into black clouds, boiling upward from beneath the cabin floor, where a jury-rigged, improperly maintained heater sat. The toxic fumes spread rapidly, filling the cabin faster than anyone could react. The heat spiked. Breathing became difficult, then impossible. Coughing turned into choking. Panic set in. The human body betrays itself in these moments. Lungs seize, vision blurs, limbs stop obeying, thoughts fragment. People clawed forward instinctively, hands scraping across seats and bodies in front of them, desperate for air that was no longer there. Up in the cockpit, the pilots had a small advantage. The cockpit door partially shielded them from the worst of the smoke. They had instruments, radio contact, and windows they could open. They began emergency procedures, scanning the countryside below for a safe landing. But for the 7 passengers, there was nothing. No training, no equipment, no oxygen, no escape route. Only smoke, heat, terror, and the primal drive to survive. When the plane struck the cow pasture less than 2 miles from the intended runway, the pilots managed to crawl through shattered cockpit windows. Brad Rank and Kenneth Ferguson emerged, blistered, coughing, alive. Behind them, in the passenger cabin, 7 people lay crumpled at the front. Forensic analysis confirmed they had died from smoke inhalation before impact, suffocating while still airborne. The exit door was inches away. Some bodies were found with fingers clutched around the handle. They almost made it, but their bodies gave out before freedom could be reached. Rick Nelson, Helen Blair, and 5 others, all with families, plans, and futures, died not because escape was impossible, but because negligence allowed a preventable disaster to unfold. If the heater had been properly repaired, if the aircraft had been grounded after repeated mechanical failures, if human life had been valued over profit, those 7 would have survived to land safely and celebrate New Year's Eve. Instead, they suffocated, their last moments filled with panic and confusion, killed by choices made far above their heads. For 40 years, the truth was buried under rumors of drug use and vague official statements about probable heater malfunction. Now the evidence is clear. This was corporate negligence with a body count. People who knew the aircraft was unsafe let it fly anyway. 7 lives were lost, and those responsible, operators, mechanics, decision-makers, walked away free. It was not an accident. It was preventable. It was unforgivable. If the mechanics who later came forward had refused to approve those shoddy repairs back in 1985, even if it meant losing their jobs, could Rick Nelson and the 6 others have survived? Or would the company simply have found someone else willing to cut corners and send the plane into the air anyway? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.